This is Booked on Rock. I'm Eric Senich. Our guests this episode, Kenneth Womack and Jason Kruppa, authors of All Things Must Pass Away, Harrison, Clapton, and Other Assorted Love Songs. George Harrison and Eric Clapton embarked upon a singular personal and creative friendship that impacted rock's unfolding future in resounding and far-reaching ways. All Things Must Pass Away, George Harrison, Eric Clapton, and Other Assorted Love Songs will trace the emergence of their relationship from 1968 through the early 1970s. In particular, authors Womack and Kruppa devote close attention to the climax of Harrison and Clapton's shared musicianship, the November 1970 release of All Things Must Pass, Harrison's powerful emancipatory statement in the wake of the Beatles, and Layla and Other Assorted Love Songs, Clapton's impassioned reimagining of his art via Derek and the Dominos, the band that he created from the wreckage of Cream and Blind Faith. All Things Must Pass Away will provide readers with a powerful overview of Harrison and Clapton's relationship, especially in terms of the ways their revolutionary musicianship and songwriting would eclipse rock music as an evolving genre. With All Things Must Pass and Layla, Harrison and Clapton bequeathed twin recorded statements that advanced rock and roll from a windswept 1960s idealism into the edgy new reality of the 1970s. Kenneth Womack is the author of Maximum Volume and Sound Pictures, the 2-volume biography of George Martin, as well as the Beatles Encyclopedia and new critical perspectives on the Beatles. He delivers some 50 invited Beatles talks a year to audiences across the nation, while sharing his insights with media of all stripes, including National Public Radio, ABC, CBS, NBC, and Voice of America. Jason Kruppa is a music historian and creator of the Producing the Beatles podcast. To hear the songs discussed in this episode, check out the show notes page. Guys, thanks so much for being on the podcast.
Thanks for having us.
Absolutely.
The Harrison-Clapton creative friendship, really interesting area of rock and roll to explore. I want to first thank you both for writing about it, but also doing such a great job with telling the story. What led you both to teaming up to write this book about this specific story?
Well, we've been thinking about different kinds of projects we would want to pursue for several years now. And this one, interestingly, fell into our laps. And then I, through a process of duress and coercion, brought Jason on board. I don't think I'm too far off on that either. But
lots of arm twisting. Yeah.
Lots of arm twisting, virtual and in person.
Oh, yes, yes.
And we had a deep interest in telling the story of 1970, which is such an important year when you think about it from a Beatles standpoint. All things are still possible then, right?
Right.
And in addition, the closer you look at that summer of 1970, you begin to realize that these twin albums were born really out of June 1970.
And the two of them first bonded over their love of the electric guitar, and from then on, their friendship began, their creative friendship, as you explore in the book, impacted rock's future, particularly with the albums All Things Must Pass from George and Layla and Other Assorted Love Songs from Clapton. If you could talk about the connection those two albums have and their importance to rock and roll.
Well, as far as connection, George is moving into, he's sort of inching or backing into this idea of doing a solo album. And, even in late 69, he's gathering musicians around him. And this is the sort of process he talks about in earlier 1970, where he wants to build a house band for Apple artists. And so he's still thinking in terms of there's going to be an Apple, he'll be producing, there'll be signing artists. And as that sort of begins to change, he is, moving toward his album, and he starts, pulling these people that are in his orbit already into the making of that album. That's kind of his house band. And Clapton is one of those people. And that I think Clapton gave him a lot of confidence. It was important for him not just to have him, but Ringo and Klaus and these other people that he could trust to play on those sessions. And coincidentally, here comes Derek and the Dominos. They form in the middle of this, and then he gives them studio time. They record their first sessions with Spector overseeing, and then they go off and do their own thing. Once George they finished the the original sessions, the initial tracking sessions for the album with George. So it's a lot of just great creative energy, and they're all at this really important moment, both George and Eric, where they're sort of discovering themselves, and they're looking at having solo careers and not knowing exactly what that looks like.
And you did a nice job of setting things up from childhood right up until where they meet, and then they reach that point where they're making these albums. So you start with George, and he was a very spiritual person, and that, as you wrote, began very early in his life. He began thinking about religion, having questions about religion around the age of 11, right?
Right.
And, at first we debated how far we wanted to go back, but you can't tell this story about their relationship without understanding how different their childhoods were, and how very starkly different. George has such a convivial household. He grows up with a certain level of confidence and about what he thinks, and what kind of pursuits, limited as they may be at that time, that he wants to enjoy. Eric, meanwhile, is the product of a broken home. He is raised by relatives. When he finally meets, his mother in particular, it's a bit of a letdown. And then you can't not also talk about Patty Boyd, who has this kind of fractured upbringing. And we discovered that it was really important to think about those issues. And you're right, the spirituality that George brings, and Jason deserves really great credit for really punching up in the 1970 moment the way we understand George's spirituality and how it impacts the album and what he was trying to do. Just to pick a random example, with My Sweet Lord and those splendid backing vocals and those vocalized prayers.
Yeah, and as for his love of music, that started, like all of the musicians from the classic rock era, with the radio. Started with skiffle, and then from there he was introduced to rockabilly and country and western, and he got his first guitar and really worked hard at playing the guitar, continued to improve really right through the Beatles' years into his solo career, especially when he incorporated the slide guitar into his songs, which starts with All Things Must Pass.
Just really quickly, Jason, one of my favorite moments with George is the 3 telegrams, right, on the day that Brian Epstein tells him they have this EMI contract.
I love that story.
Yeah, Lennon and McCartney are saying snarky things like, when are we going to be millionaires, send money? And Harrison's like, let's get new guitars.
Yes.
Right. Very practical.
What do you think of him as a guitarist overall?
I mean, is anything with the Beatles underrated? I mean, they're sort of in the air, but I think the slide playing, what I discovered in researching this is that the slide playing in particular was something that he took to very quickly. He was first introduced to it in December 1969 while touring with Delaney and Bonnie, and Delaney encouraged him to play slide, and so he took that over for the rest of the tour, and then he began to study that himself. And he uses, I was again surprised to find this on the Radha Krishna Temple album, which he records in February and March. He plays kind of a dobro sound on there. I'm not sure it's an actual dobro. It might be just an acoustic guitar, but that sound is already there. He's already got that haunting touch that you're going to hear as he develops that style in All Things Must Pass, and then sessions after that over the next few years. So, I mean, I think that he really continued to develop as a musician more than John or Paul did. He just really dug into this particular style. And I don't want to go, I don't have the expertise to go into all of his solo career and talk about how, he may have developed in terms of songwriting or musicianship, but I think certainly in this period he is pushing himself.
It's interesting too, because when the Beatles first start, George wasn't much of a songwriter, and I don't think John and Paul really even thought about that. But then George said they were pretty supportive of him, even though the power structure starts to change and John and Paul are pretty much the sole songwriters, but George said they were pretty supportive of him whenever he started to write a song, brought it to the table, and they seemed to like what they heard.
Yeah, I mean, it was very difficult for him. We talk about this in the book quite a bit, where, you know, he's coming up with these ideas, and they've had each other to spar off of, and they've been, you know, writing songs solo for years. So they've kind of written their bad songs, and he's having to step out into the spotlight immediately and try to measure up. So they were very supportive, but there was, you know, there also comes a point where they're just kind of impatient, and he describes it as having to present a song to them and get them to understand it quickly. And I think he had a sense of I think he was frustrated, maybe not patient enough to work it through with them, and maybe they weren't patient enough to kind of see it through and see, you know, what he wanted for a particular song. And All Things Must Pass, the song, is a really good example of that. You know, they don't dismiss it so much. If you listen to the Get Back sessions, they do try to work through arrangements, but it never really coalesces. It never really comes together into anything satisfying. And I think he realized that and stepped away from it and thought, you know, this isn't going to work for this band.
It's so well said, Jason. If they didn't catch on with it very quickly, it was going to be a lost cause. You can hear on that first day of the Get Back sessions when George is playing Let It Down and John is there, they're by themselves, and Lennon just isn't interested and becomes noodling along with something else that's not even in the same key.
Yeah.
And, you know, that would be a good example of one of those that he almost had to put back in the quiver.
It seems like it was the perfect time for the Beatles to break up, certainly for George. I know John wanted to break free too, but for George, he's right at that point where he was ready to just be the sole songwriter and do his own thing.
He was, but, you know, and again, we go into this in great detail in the book. He's conflicted, you know, and Patty observed this too, that he'd been a part of this for so long. He felt free, but he also felt very sad that this was ending this way.
And I'm sure he was a little concerned, like all four of the guys, how is the world going to accept me on my own, not as a Beatle?
Right. And he's also, in at least one interview, he talks about how people are kind of expecting the Beatles to go on, and he understands what it means to people, what the Beatles mean to the world. And you know, early in the years, talking hopefully about, you know, we'll record solo projects and then probably do another album at some point. We'll all get bored of, you know, doing our little dabbling thing, and then we'll come back together. So some of that may be denial, some of it may be damage control, but it's a pretty complex thing that he's going through. I think he's coming to some sort of an acceptance of what's happening.
I always think of the Pink Floyd reunion for Live 8. If there was anything that would have gotten the Beatles back together, would have been something like that. And you guys, I'm sure, remember, what was it, Live 8, the rumors that Paul, Ringo, and George were going to reunite for Live 8, but that turned out to not be true. But it would be something like that, I think, you know, if John were to live. Something that wasn't just for the money.
Sure. I think you're absolutely right. And, you know, John lives, that money's getting too big. I think by the early 1980s, certainly by Live Aid, they would have succumbed. I mean, when you can get a one-day payoff of $1 billion, I mean, that can change a country, right?
Yeah.
And that was $1 billion back in 1980. So, you know, I don't know that they could have resisted much longer being the progressives that they were. And so, but having said that, it certainly would have been better than Pink Floyd. That was so hard to watch, right? With Roger Waters, he was almost trying too hard to be a good guy in dealing with them.
He seemed to be more happy to be there than the other guys, or at least more happy than David.
Sure. And Gilbert, you can see Gilmore just glancing over at Nicky Mason occasionally in a knowing way. I think they would have been a lot more convivial than that.
Yeah. And you think those two guys, the relationship between Roger and David and the relationship between, I guess, to use the parallel, John and Paul, I think John and Paul had a lot more of a love and appreciation for each other than David and Roger. So, I think it would have happened. Patty Boyd, you did mention Patty, and she meets George in the early 60s. So she's part of this story very early on. She experienced the height of the Beatles' fame an English model. She later said George was not just the best-looking member of the band, but the best-looking man she'd ever seen. But when George asked her out, she rejected him. But that wouldn't last long. They had a strong connection from the get-go, huh?
Absolutely. And, she's such an interesting story in the way that, she approached life. And I think, again, and Jason really made sure that we dug deep and went back as far as we could with all these main characters to understand them. Because she too, like Clapton, suffers from this really broken experience, driven by trauma, and uncertainty about your place in the world. And when you start to understand the connection that they share through that lens, frankly, it is not this great love story that so many listeners would like it to be.
No, and it seems as it develops in the story, it seems inevitable. These two very deeply wounded people have found each other, and they see something familiar, even if they can't articulate it, even if they don't even understand it consciously. They are drawn to this aspect that they see, and there was also no way that was going to last without probably intensive therapy, even then. And, obviously it didn't. We can, we look at this from 40, 50 years hindsight. We can see that. But, in the midst of it, obviously they couldn't.
And by the mid-'60s, George found his voice as a songwriter and started contributing on a regular basis to Beatles albums. And you write that of those songs from that era, Think for Yourself from 1965's Rubber Soul is where he starts to stretch out, dig deeper, both lyrically and melodically. And you write about what, and more importantly, who sparked this new depth, which was Ravi Shankar?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a combination of him experiencing and digging deeper into Eastern spirituality. I mean, certainly LSD had a certain effect. It affected all of them and made them think about things differently. They're experiencing a lot of different things. So you're being who they were, where they were in the world, and who they were interacting with, and the things they were seeing and doing. They couldn't help but be changed. And George always had, the kind of serious, dour side. So, his songwriting was obviously going to reflect some of that. But yeah, I think Ravi Shankar, and I think studying the music and studying the spirituality, which is all as a whole, it's not one or the other, it's both. He began considering a lot of different new ideas and gaining a new perspective on the world that he hadn't had before.
And Patty's on board with this spiritual journey.
Yeah, she to a point. I mean, she does say that at one point, they come back from India, and he's talking about wanting concubines and being like Krishna, and just he has this kind of wild idea of, and it doesn't seem to last. But George could shift gears. To the extent that they're studying meditation and they're studying spirituality and they're going to India, and they're sharing these experiences together.
They seem to be doing pretty well at that point as a married couple.
Right. I do think something, I can't quite put my finger on it, but there was she talks about how he begins meditating to the point that he's isolating himself. And he admitted that he was doing that. So I think there came a point somewhere 68, 69 where it became an escape for him maybe, and something he might not even have at the time realized he was doing. He had an obsessive side to his personality for sure.
Yeah, so she might have felt a little alienated by that.
Right.
While Harrison had grown up in a supportive, loving household that imbued him with the confidence to speak his mind, Clapton could only recall a life of introversion. Can you talk a little bit about, we mentioned it early on, but Eric's childhood so different. He's living in, quote, a house full of secrets.
Yeah, he is. And, his life, and he makes no bones about this, is characterized by a sense of abandonment and his own response to this with a kind of, preemptive abandonment of others. And you can see him behaving this way. over and over again, whether it's personal relationships or professional ones. Look at all the bands that he goes through. One of my favorite anecdotes that Clapton freely shares is that day in, I don't know, it was Hyde Park, perhaps, I believe it was, with Blind Faith making their performance debut. And he's literally thinking before they played a public note, I've got to get out of this band. I mean, that's how infused this is in his character. And we see it again in that moment when he and Patty finally do get together, when it seems free and clear, and he's already, cheating on her. In the moment in which this thing is finally realized, he's abandoning her. It's really staggering. But I mean, that is part of our human condition. And given having grown up in a house full of secrets, and it turns out most of them were about him, he reacted that way and probably still does to a certain extent.
And this is a story that's been told many times, but just want to get it out there for those who may not be aware of Clapton's backstory. Until he was 9 years old, the woman he thought was his sister was actually his mother. His mother is Patricia Molly Clapton. She was just 16 when she met and had a brief relationship with Eric's father, Edward Walter Fryer.
Yeah, I mean, he's born out of wedlock, and to cover this, they say that she's his sister, and they sustain that even when she moves away, marries somebody else, comes back later with a whole new family, and is expecting to be now acknowledged as her son once he figures this out, and then is denied that. I mean, what a tragic, traumatic event.
One side of him that's worth noting, if there's a positive byproduct, and it's hard to find one because there's nothing ideal about any of this, and certainly not the preemptive abandonment behavior, it is that he is pretty good at sizing people up, right? So he can tell, to use the old phrase, shit from Shinola. He can quickly kind of ascertain how someone's going to behave because he's always on the lookout for betrayal and disloyalty and cracks in his relationships with people. So he quickly realizes that Paul's a salesman, the first time he meets him. He realizes that John is probably too slippery to mess with. Ringo seems like a nice guy, but it's George who seems genuine to him.
Right, and that's why they connect.
Yeah.
And his first love wasn't music or the guitar. And this is interesting because he had his battles with addictions. Early on, sweets. He loved candy. That was his first addiction. He couldn't stop eating candy. What did he go to, like the penny store and would take all the candy he could, right?
Yeah. I don't know if you want Jason and I to comment on the risk to one's, dental hygiene with this. I mean, obviously, we've both become armchair psychotherapists.
Right. But music enters his life and he feels a sense of comfort there. It's his only solace. And there's an interesting story in chapter 3 that shows Eric's musical intuition was there early on. His grandmother Rose would play the piano. He would sing along, and he found that there was one place in the house he preferred to sing because it sounded like he was singing on a record. I thought that was interesting. He had that musical mind early on.
Yeah, I mean, he was a very sensitive kid for obvious reasons. I mean, I was thinking kind of ahead here in terms of, how he develops as a musician and how he takes this sensitivity. He's humble, maybe to a fault, but he's also incredibly sensitive in what he plays into the people around him. So that's, this all plays into, Ken was talking about, maybe there's a bright side to this, or the positive aspect of that is that as an artist, he really turned this into something. It's something coming out of his nervous system.
And again, the radio plays a huge role. And back then, radio exposed listeners to a wide range of music. And something occurred to me while I'm reading this book, because he's exposed to opera, classical, rock and roll, jazz, and pop. And it's such a common backstory with the classic rock, quote unquote, classic rock musicians. That early radio format, which didn't stick to one genre of music that influenced the sound of classic rock. So many of those artists infused those other styles of music into what became known as the classic rock sound. Would you agree the radio played a huge role in that era of rock and roll?
Absolutely. And, the British experience in particular, because, if you listen to, obviously there was pirate radio for a certain period, but if you listen to standard BBC fare, you would be treated to all different kinds of music all day. There'd be the classical hour or jazz or what have you. So, you see guys like George and Eric, and of course the other Beatles, learning about different kinds of styles and being comfortable with them. And so some of our best classic rock does have a lot of different kinds of nuance to it, which is what makes it interesting, right? It has variety.
Yeah, I mean, I think they were taking all of these things they were hearing and at such a formative age, each of them, just saying, well, this is music, and I respond to this, and I respond to this, and I respond to this, and they all happen to be different styles of music, but to them, it's all good. So they just sort of take all that in, and then when they begin playing themselves, it comes out. It's all synthesized already.
Yeah, maybe that's part of the problem with when they say that, the rock and roll today is not what it was before. Maybe a lot of these artists, they grew up and they were basically spoon-fed one type of music through radio. Even now you have, algorithms. So if you play something on YouTube, it's going to give you something that's very similar to that. Whereas in those days, you'd hear something country and Western. The next track is a jazz and next track is blues. And I think that plays a huge role in forming somebody as a musician.
It was definitely a lot simpler. I mean, even when I was growing up, it was simpler. We just didn't have as many options. And so now you have so many options, and yet that algorithm, like you say, if I watch something on YouTube, then I get 50 suggestions of the same thing. That's not really introducing me to a larger world. That's just giving me more of what I've looked at already. I mean, I think you can still find new things and be interested, and the trick is always to be curious.
There you go. Yeah, absolutely. Chuck Berry, the bluesman, Big Bill Broonzy were big influences, but it was Robert Johnson. That really moved Eric in a way that no other musician could. He was around 12 or 13 when he discovered Robert Johnson.
Well, absolutely. And of course, he loved the mythos, right? He loved the story. He wanted, think about it, he didn't like his story. He wanted a better story. And Robert Johnson brought that. And of course, there was something interesting in loving the blues because not everybody was making that connection. It's a genre that he precipitates and participates in the creation of the British blues boom. So, he gets to be a central player in that. And that's pretty exciting.
The 4-Year Love Story is interesting. Many musicians would be ecstatic to hear they have their first hit single. But for Eric, it was anything but the case. He's in the Yardbirds, who are on the brink of fame with this top 10 single. But for him, this is why he quit the band.
Yeah. And this is one where we want to put a giant asterisk next to it, right?
Yeah.
So, yes, he gets to claim in the moment and in later years that he felt like, they were relinquishing their bluesmen credentials, right? But you can't understand this without also recognizing that he's making that early exit. He's punching in his chips and getting out of there. So we always have to understand his movements, I believe, with that calling card.
Yeah. So you think he was using that as, I don't want to say excuse, but that was his reasoning for it, but it was really something more deep rooted. It was the abandonment issue.
Yeah, he was like Ken said, as a preemptive, abandoning something before he gets abandoned. That sense of being unsettled was so familiar to him that he would create those situations. Yeah, I mean, I think so. I think I just, the story about, we're too popular or we're giving up our blues bona fides. It's so silly,
And it was during this time that he was given the nickname Slow Hand. He would often break his string, and while he was changing his string, the audience would often break into a slow hand clap.
Right. Yeah. And of course, he has all sorts of mythos around him. The Clapton is God incident. even, and all of it contributes when you start to think about his psychology. It all contributes to this kind of complex that he has. And I think even under normal circumstances, he probably would have had that.
Yeah, he was not comfortable with being called God.
It absolutely was against, if you go back to his blues bona fides, I mean, that's not something he would want to be. And of course, by the time that's happening, there are a lot of people who could make that claim. He has been, one thing I love about Clapton is just how honest he is about his place in the music business, right? He's very honest about the fact that, he has good days and bad days. There are a lot of days when he is not God. And he's honest about Hendrix and about his enormous talent and what he saw when he came of age. There's just so much to love when you begin to study the Clapton story. And I think, even though I don't think any of us would want these characteristics to be part of our makeup, you have to love, or at least admire at some level, his ability to be honest about them.
Then comes the formation of Cream, which rock's first supergroup. Eric Clapton, Jack Bruce, Ginger Baker. I mean, this is a dream come true for Eric musically. He was able to explore the blues along with whatever else came out of that magical potion that the three could come up with. That's a band. I don't know if you'll never have another band like that again.
Yeah, and again, it wasn't going to last. I mean, I think the personalities at play there were just too volatile. Ginger Baker, Clapton, when he comes back around later on and he sees that he's been using heroin, it's just, he knows what he's in for. He knows how bad it's going to be. So, it's incredibly dramatic, and it sort of suits the drama of Eric's life and his story.
And what is his reason again? He says, I want to get out of Cream because I hear the band's music from Big Pink. And so now it's time for me to go again. Kind of similar to the Yardbird story.
Right.
Yeah, it's the same self-inflicted wound. And, you could read it another way, certainly, that it provides him with all sorts of interesting variety that makes his career that richer. So there's a nice corrective way to look at it. But you have to wonder with a band like Cream, could they have gone to other places if he hadn't, pricked the balloon, as it were?
Right.
What did you think about that reunion when they got back together?
I don't know if I want to touch that one. No, I only say that because, and I'm not suggesting it was some kind of money grab or anything like that, but, it's what John Lennon always said about the Beatles, right? Even if they'd gotten back together in 1972, they would not have been the same band. And these guys were not the same band, right? No. And you hear them, and it can bring a smile to your face that all of them are alive, particularly Ginger, after what he had done to his body over and over again. You got to feel somewhat good about that. But I'm a sentimentalist, so it made me feel good, that they were able to in some fashion find themselves. But it's almost like it's a strange kind of postscript to a band's story, just like the Threedles, right? And the anthology. It can make you feel good about certain things, but gosh, it's not the same thing.
Well, look at Robert Plant. Robert Plant they've thrown a lot of money his way to get back with Zeppelin. And I think he's the one, and he's the only one who's really put the stop to it. He just has basically said time and time again, guys, it is not going to be what it was then. So let's just move forward.
Yeah, and that is obviously, Jason and I would never want John Lennon to have been murdered, but they would have harmed, I think, their reputation by getting back together. It would not have been, wouldn't have been the same thing. All the things that John Lennon was worried about, I think, would have come true.
Sure.
And I think this is jumping way out off topic, but
But let's do.
Yeah, I mean, and there's a little bit of this in the book, but the rift between George and Paul just deepened over the years. In '74, he's interviewed and he says, well, I'd rather play bass. I'd rather have somebody else on bass in my band than Paul McCartney. Like, he never wanted to be in a band with him again. Mm. He said that at that point. So, what was going to heal that wound? What was going to bring them back together? So yeah, it's a big question mark.
The Booked on Rock podcast will return after this.
This is Ken Calais, producer, engineer of Fleetwood Mac's Rumors and Tusk, and author of Get Tusk.
This is Hernan Rojas, co-author of Get Tusk, and you're listening to the Booked on Rock podcast with Eric Senich.
We're back with more of the Booked on Rock podcast. Towards the end of his tenure with Cream, around 1968, Eric moves into a home near George, moved into Hurtwood Edge, right near where George lived in Esher. So this allowed the two to continue their friendship. George co-writes the song Badge on Cream's final studio album, Goodbye. Eric plays on George's Beatles song, While My Guitar Gently Weeps. But this is also where Eric falls in love with Patty. They both had that physical and spiritual attraction right away. The three of them spent a lot of time together. Is there any indication that George picked up on this attraction between the two right away?
I think the evidence shows us that he was, he's not a stupid guy. He's very shrewd. He recognizes this. But let's face it, George had his own personal life that he carried out for a long time, right? We know this. For him to question flirtation, I think would have made him a hypocrite. And of course, as we know, he hated hypocrisy in all of its forms. Now, having said that, there were a couple of moments where he really said, where he kind of put Clapton on notice, famously at one event, which is suddenly I'm unable to recall, but he's not a stupid guy, but he also is, like I said, he's not a hypocrite by any means. And George, Olivia has even been quite honest about George. What did Paul McCartney call it, Jason? His red-bloodedness.
Right. I mean, yeah, he was definitely having his dalliances, and Eric had said at one point in some later interview, he says, there was this whole sense of the free love period where, it's not that big of a deal. So that's in the air as well. That's something we can't really discount in terms of, they're maintaining this friendship in the face of, and at the time it may not have seemed like what it did later on. It's become this really kind of epic, dramatic love story, or this almost really a tabloid love story. And if we're looking at the late 60s, that's not the same world we're living in later in the 70s, when these things are continuing and developing and these relationships are becoming more complicated. So I think we have to look at it as a constantly developing thing.
Yeah, I think just like you said, that time you have to put things into perspective too. In those days, especially if you're in rock and roll, it's not all that shocking if somebody or a bandmate is into your girlfriend or wife. I mean, it's probably George's like, yeah, okay.
Yeah, I mean, Eric he says at one point that George even maybe half seriously, half jokingly proposed that they, swap women or something. I forget exactly the term that he uses, but it's a very misogynistic kind of attitude. Like, it's just okay with the women. You maybe want to check with them. But it was a very different mindset in that period. So we do have to take that into account.
Getting back to the music, 1970, Eric releases his self-titled album, followed shortly after by the Derek and the Dominos album, Layla and Other Assorted Love Songs. That same year, George releases All Things Must Pass, produced by George and Phil Spector. An interesting portion of Chapter 6, titled Harrison Comes Alive. It's about George's sessions featuring live band performances, which often featured a large ensemble of players. Guests were not uncommon, but no record was kept, so you did a nice job of cross-referencing interviews and known dates to clear up a lot of questions as to who was on that album and when. But it really was a who's who of rock royalty.
Yeah, I mean there's no way for us to know for certain who played what on what session. We do the best we can. I've seen books where people say, "Oh, well, this is it. This is the ultimate list. I figured it out." And what's that?
I said, I've cracked the code.
Right. And the reality is you're not going to crack the code. I mean, memories are too fuzzy and too much time has gone by. And, a few things you can figure out for certain just because certain people were out of the country at certain times. So they couldn't possibly have been at the sessions. But, a lot of it's a mystery. The thing that I'm proudest of in all of that is that I think I finally pieced together the chronology, the sort of figured out the dates of when Derek and the Dominos actually came together, how that all progressed from Eric and Bobby being there at the beginning of the sessions to Carl showing up and then finally Jim Gordon showing up and sort of swooping in and taking a position they were holding for Jim Keltner for that gig on June 14th at the Lyceum, which even the week before they had advertised as having Keltner in the band. So it's a very quick change from having him to saying, okay, well, Jim Gordon is now in the band. And now they have a name, Derek and the Dominos. And now they go and record, their first sessions. George gives them session time to be able to do that. So that's something I feel pretty certain about, unless I find other information that sort of counteracts that. But this runs counter to the myth that Derek and the Dominos were the house band for the entire album.
It also is very useful, and I think this is one of Jason's best discoveries, is how different that album would have turned. Both albums, really, if Gordon isn't the drummer.
Right.
It has ramifications both in that present moment and then, of course, later with Layla.
So they wanted Jim Keltner in the band?
Yeah, they had planned. They had invited him. They were forming a band. Bobby Whitlock gets to England around March, April, and he's living with Eric at Hurtwood Edge, and they're playing and writing songs and jamming, and they decide they want to start a band, and Keltner is the drummer they choose, and he's working on a jazz album in Los Angeles, but he says he'll be over as soon as he's finished. And this isn't in the book because I only discovered this about a week and a half ago, but I was talking to another journalist who was doing a story on the album for the box set. And he talked to Jim Keltner. And Keltner looked at his journal for May and June. And sure enough, he was recording an album, and he wasn't going to be finished by June 14th, that Lyceum date. He was not going to be finished until sometime in July. Now, so my thought is that they were planning to have him in the touring band. They were starting a band, and they were going to tour to support Eric's solo album, which was recorded in January, and then they would record more material. They would start this new band. So they would be touring, but they would also be creating these new recordings. That seems to be, from what I can piece together, what the plan was.
Jim Keltner is an interesting guy. Tom Petty wanted to have him as an official Wilbury. And Keltner said, no, I just want to be in the background. His name pops up so many times when you talk about these great bands.
Yeah, I mean, the personality of somebody who keeps a journal so religiously like that, it can just flip it open and say, oh, yeah, well, here's what I was doing in May, June 1970. Contrast that with Jim Gordon, who is a totally volatile character. Think of the difference in what All Things Must Pass would have been and then what Layla would have been. Would it have been better? It certainly would have been different. Would they have stayed together longer? Would Keltner have said, nah, this is too crazy for me, I'm out? What would that have looked like?
The name Derek and the Dominos, is there a psychological aspect to that? I think Clapton talked about it. Was somebody suggested the name? Was it Dell and the Dominos?
Yeah, he was nicknamed Derek or Dell by Delaney, and I think it was comes from that. But Ken will also want to talk about this. But I think it's he wanted to hide behind something.
Yeah, right.
He didn't want to be out in the spotlight, and I think he relished this idea of kind of being anonymous.
Sure, it was for him, that kind of secret identity. Robert Stigwood, though, as we know, felt like it was something that needed to be handled because, of course, it was making it difficult to think about selling tickets, which, of course, is what a manager should worry about.
Yeah.
And selling albums. I mean, yeah, who's Derek?
And weren't the fans disappointed when they first got a chance to see Derek and the Dominos perform? Wasn't there criticism of Eric's voice? And
yeah, that Lyceum show on June 14th was there were some good responses, but there were also some really, really strong negative reviews that made the music papers.
That's hard to believe.
The fans wrote in and said, totally panned it.
That is hard to believe.
Such an interesting, and we had fun with this all throughout. It's an interesting time capsule when you go back and read the music press from that period, just about how differently we consume music, and with what level of, I don't know what the word is, with what level of
expectations,
and also engagement, right? We went from, if you look back at the 40s and the 50s with a, not the same kind of fanaticism that you would see, even with the Bobby Soxers and Sinatra. It's not the same as Beatlemania. It was true full imbibing of the music and the experience. And we've kind of gone back a little bit on that in the when we move past the classic rock era.
And rock journalism, as it came to be known in the 70s, really, it wasn't quite there yet. Certainly not in Britain. The British papers, which is did a lot of digging in that, which hadn't seen referenced before. So that was really eye opening in terms of information. But in terms of the way things were written, they were still stuck in a very 60s style.
Well, one thing I've said so many times. The Beatles, if they had come out today, would they have been the Beatles? Because the Ed Sullivan Show at the time that aired, what else was on? Now there's a million options that kids have. And I think it was 70 million people watching the Ed Sullivan Show the night the Beatles were on.
Right.
You won't get that ever again, even like on American Idol or America's Got Talent, things like that. Sure, a lot of exposure, no doubt, but
there's that, and it's also the fact that it's a moment in time. They are perfectly positioned in that moment for that experience. I saw somebody comment on the film today on Twitter. They'd just seen it, and there's a whole thread of comments. And somebody talked about the original version of the story is this guy has this experience, and no one else knows who the Beatles are, so he knows all the songs. And he expects to be incredibly popular, and he has some moderate popularity, but not really that much. And the point of that version of the story is that, it's the time. It was the 60s. It was that particular moment where this happened, and these were the people that did these things, and that's why they were popular. It's not that the music isn't still good, because it is, but it had such force because it came at that particular time.
Sure. And there was no 24-hour sports. There were 3 networks in the United States, and most cities only had 2. They didn't often have all 3 affiliates. So, it was just a very different time. And you were able to capture a different level of attention in the way that you just can't now.
Well, that's what I was going to say, the level of attention that's put into music. In those days, somebody went out and bought a record. They sat down. That was an event to them. They would sit down, put the thing on the turntable, carve out some time out of that day or night, and listen to each song. With MP3s, streaming services, a lot of it is just one song. And a lot of times people don't even know who sings that song, doesn't even know the band or artist. They just like the song. So they don't have that connection as they did back in those days. Beatles fan goes out and gets a new Beatles album. Man, they're going to carve out that whole day, night, and maybe that whole week, and they're just going to listen to it over and over and over again.
And I think that points to why George would release not just a double album, but a triple album. The attention was there, the interest was there, even if most of us have never played the bonus disc. And Layla's a double album. That was possible then, and certainly double albums were released after that, and triple albums, but the mindset was that, yeah, you can get away with this, and it's massive selling albums. Well, All Things Must Pass was at first, and then Layla has become a much better seller afterward. Yeah, the attitude, it's much different than today, where you're right, it is sort of back to almost a singles market.
Yep. My Sweet Lord began when George was with Eric and Billy Preston in Denmark.
Right. He talks about wanting to write a gospel song, and he's been doing this, I think, consciously with intent, at least as early as, maybe sometime late 68, early 69. And he plays some of these songs at the Get Back session. So he's playing Hear Me, Lord. This is essentially a gospel song. It's very spiritual. So he's continuing that, and he's working with Billy Preston, and he begins to realize that Hare Krishna and Hallelujah have the same amount of syllables. And he begins experimenting with guitar chords, and he brings this to the Delaney and Bonnie people and finishes that idea with Billy Preston. And then he carries it into his own sessions, where it becomes something else entirely.
And George did all of the backing vocals. He even worked with the tape speed to get just the right sound. I always love stuff like that, a little minutia, the stories behind these songs. I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, that's a very Beatlesque thing, where they're recording things at different speeds and playing back, at regular speed, so they sound sped up or slowed down. And from a production point of view, he had absorbed all of the stuff that John and Paul had been doing, and he knew how to do it just as well as they did. That's one of the things that he shows on this album, is that he has a really strong grasp of production. And
you also wrote that Eric had absorbed some of George's messages in the song lyrics, subliminal messages between two friends. You quoted keyboardist Bobby Whitlock, who felt that.
Yeah, that's Bobby's point of view. We put that in because, he's in the room, and I think he's sensing these things. And he was, he's 20 years old at that time. So I think he was having these really vivid experiences that he was, they were going to form really strong memories for him. And so that's what he was seeing. Yeah. George's songs were very personal and not just spiritual, but he was going through a lot of things emotionally at that time. And, obviously the people in the room, if they're listening to the lyrics, have to pick up on this.
And Eric had started using heroin around this point. He knew the dangers, but he felt he could handle it.
I think it was certainly fascinating for those guys, and I think Bobby is an endlessly interesting character in this story. He got to see firsthand how those lyrics changed and evolved, but then he also has the sad duty of watching as Eric descends into this, this malaise that lasts several years. It's one of the great tragedies of the story. And, of course, popular folklore has said that he descends into this heroin malaise because of Patty, but of course it's so much more than that.
Yeah.
We've simplified in our understanding of the story so much of what was happening during that period.
The Duane Allman death also contributed to it too. He was really hit hard by that.
But losing the Freebird, right? The guy who would inspire that tune was certainly a tragedy. But yeah, I love the moment where, realizing the pain that Eric's in, George tries to do him a solid by taking him to the Bangladesh event and providing him with what could have been a very positive stage experience for Eric, then only to go back into his malaise. Sort of reminds me of the end of their story when Eric is trying to do a solid for his friend, right? And creates the Japanese tour, and then, of course, does take a strong, not slow hand in the concert for George.
And an interesting story as to how Eric and Duane hooked up. The Allman Brothers happened to be in town playing in Miami Beach, and producer Tom Dowd grabbed Eric and the guys and said, "Hey, I got some people I want you to hear." And then 2 days later, Duane's in the studio playing on the Layla album.
Well, it was staged to a certain extent, right? By their handlers, bringing them there, ushering them into that space where it's such a Southern thing. They're all on lawn chairs in front of the stage, probably with a beer koozie right next to the thing. And I mean, it did become a very useful creative outlet at the time. The more I think about this, though, and Jason and I have talked a lot about this, part of the challenge of listening to Layla now, as opposed to the really professional construction of All Things Must Pass, is just the roughness of it. Now, I know that appeals to some folks, but these guys were not, they were having fun, certainly, too much fun with substance abuse, but they were swimming on the beach every day, and they were having a pretty good time. But part of the challenge of how hard they were living, you can hear now in some of the songs where they're not necessarily in tune with each other. It has a homespun feel to it, in spite of they had a great producer and very fine facilities there in Miami.
Yeah, and it's such a huge contrast between that and All Things Must Pass, which is this controlled, worked over, very deliberate way of recording. And then, the overdubs and all the post-production is so meticulous.
There's an interesting parallel there that Clapton's working with Duane Allman, who's considered one of the, if not the greatest slide guitarists of all time. And then there's George Harrison. He's now become this prolific slide guitarist. Pretty interesting parallels there.
Oh, absolutely. And of course, George is becoming, he's creating a sound, right, that will become his signature for much of the rest of his life. That kind of beautiful, buoyant, even when he's not playing slide, right, the way he plays guitar, he is creating a certain voice for his instrument that is just undeniable. Now, Duane is very cognizant of how good he is, and good for him, he should be. He's very cognizant of the high quality of his playing, and he manages to share a lot of that knowledge and musicianship with Clapton. And of course, he gets the last word in Layla. I mean, not on the album, which is actually Bobby Whitlock's with the song that he had authored, Thorn Tree in the Garden. But he gets that last word in the title track with that beautiful mimicking sound of the bird.
What did George think about Duane? Is there anything that's documented? Did those guys even know each other at all? They must have.
I don't know that they did. George hasn't spoken that much really about that album, to my knowledge. I leave that to other folks. There certainly are a lot of Harrison scholars out in our world who do that kind of work and who think about him. An important corrective to think about with Harrison is just the simple fact that he did not look back. He was not a guy who reminisced. In fact, one of the few examples, and it's a beloved one of mine, is that YouTube video, right, where you see George step into the studio years later when somebody has This Boy queued up. And you can watch George as he listens to it, and you can see he's feeling wistful. But for the most part, he wasn't a guy who looked back. He would spend a lot of time always working on the next thing. And he was still working with some of the Apple artists, as late as 74, 75. He's still trying to help them along, like Splinter and others. So he was always into something. And he had his own rich life outside of music. He wasn't kidding about gardening, right?
Yeah, that became a total obsession. I think that interested him more than even music at some point. That just became his kind of abiding passion.
Well, he wouldn't have been the first Brit to do that, right, Jason?
No, certainly not.
The song Layla, that's, of course, the standout from the album. The song came from an old story of Arabic origin, ties in with Eric's feelings for Patty.
Right, and that when that was given to him, that story that he could then have in his brain, it gave him a narrative to wrap it all around. So it was probably a bit of a dangerous thing for him to have in his intellectual memory, right? Because it gave him a way of elevating this as some kind of great love story. I'm not sure that was good for him to have that concoction suddenly available to him. But yeah, he began to see that as the story that would help him understand how he saw himself vis-a-vis Patty and George. Now, the mature Eric would later say, at a certain point, I just knew a much richer guy and I wanted to have what he had. In later years, he was able to say those things to himself in a more mature fashion. But that certainly isn't how it was early on.
He also hoped that music would convince Patty to leave George and be with him, but that did not happen. And he tried everything. He even threatened to take heroin full time if she didn't leave George.
Right.
Yeah, it's such a bizarre. I mean, that's not even adolescent. It's pre-adolescent, behavior. This kind of bargaining for your attention, for your affection. And look back, cast that in his relationship with his mother. I mean, what kind of bargaining was going on there? I mean, again, we're playing armchair psychologist, and I feel like it's unavoidable when we're talking about these things. But it's a different perspective on this story. I agree with Ken. I think it's not healthy to have cast this relationship in terms of this epic love poem, because it denies so much of what their inner realities were. It's certainly what his inner reality was.
Right. It wasn't anything. It didn't play out like a Hollywood story at all, which includes the time Eric confessed his feelings for Patty to George, which is where you get to in chapter 9, titled Miami, July 1970. And George's response wasn't what you would expect, or maybe it was. George was hurt by it, but he made light of it.
Yeah, I mean, I think he's in a certain amount of shock too, because his mother has just died. What was it, 3 weeks before? It's a really crazy time. A lot of heightened emotions. So who knows what was really going on in his mind, what he was really feeling. Certainly, it's kind of a bombshell to drop on somebody, no matter what.
Eventually, Eric comes out of the heroin addiction in the time after the book ends. So he did end up with Patty around 1974. He married her in 79. They divorced in 89, but Eric and George maintained their friendship from that point on. That speaks volumes of their friendship.
I mean, I think George said this several times. He wanted Patty to be with, he'd rather her be with Eric than with, some other guy who was, not going to be good for her. And I think that's a very generous attitude. But I always trace this back to their very first meeting, where George sees Eric and he says, that guy looks kind of sad, looks kind of lonely. We should invite him to come hang out with us. George was sensitive to these things. He saw things in people, and actually did something about it. And so I think that carries through their entire friendship. And it's not like it was one-sided. Eric was certainly giving back, but there's a component of this of George's generosity that I think we shouldn't overlook.
And the two remain friends. They also work together occasionally. I remember on the 1989 album Journeyman from Clapton, Harrison's on the track Run So Far. And then they toured together in 1991, the Japanese tour. They played 12 shows.
I think the Japanese tour was a big deal. That's Eric, again, sort of repaying some measure of this and trying to get George back out on the road and give him a good experience,
But, it's funny, isn't it? I mean, I don't mean funny, but it's interesting that it's not successful in a certain way. And Eric realizes this, that he's trying to create this thing and to give George, as you just said so well, a certain level of experience. But, George's dislike of the road is real. And he had just lost, maybe it was the gardening that was better, right? But he had lost that interest in having that experience, which is kind of fascinating. And he makes the best of it. But, it had ceased to be important to him in the way that it clearly still is for Clapton.
Do you favor, this is for each of you individually, do you favor one album over the other, All Things Must Pass and Layla and Other Assorted Love Songs? I mean, the Layla album has gone on, as you said, to become more popular. It's the more recognizable of the two, but they're both brilliant albums. Do you have a personal pick?
I'm happy to go first. I mean, for me, it's All Things Must Pass. I think it's a superior record in just about every facet. I think it's aged better. The Layla is a product of a week or two, really, of hard work. And there's certainly some magnificent songs. But the level of artistry to my ears is not the same as All Things Must Pass. George had gone through so much to get to that place. Eric was in another new band, and in a very fractured place in his life. And while Layla has certainly enjoyed more critical acclaim, you can often see it rated higher on, the greatest albums of all time. I think a better listening experience is All Things Must Pass. That's not taking away from some of the grittiness of Layla, or certainly the power of the title track, or Bell Bottom Blues, or even I Looked Away, right? I mean, these are wonderful tracks, but, in totality, it's All Things Must Pass for me.
No, I mean, I've listened to All Things Must Pass so many times over the years, and writing this book, I listened to it, 50 times probably. And I'm still not tired of it. It's just, maybe I'm responding to the craft, and I'm responding to the emotion that's in those songs. And, there's the whole other layer of, how much of this is referring to the Beatles, how much is this referring to John and Paul and those experiences. And it's, it's a very rich record, and it's really beautifully produced. And, a lot of people say, oh, overproduced by Phil Spector, but George was producing this record. He handled the mixing with Ken Scott. By that point, Phil Spector wasn't as involved. So, I say we credit George with that, and that's what he wanted. And a lot of it works. Even if some of it maybe sounds too echoey and overblown, I think the large majority of it is just really beautifully handled.
Well, what I get out of this book is that the friendship that Eric and George had was strong enough to endure that love triangle, which was made even more difficult when it became public knowledge. But the other thing is that during that time, All Things Must Pass and Layla were made. You see, this is the ultimate example of how the greatest artists can go through emotional turmoil, use that, or purge those emotions and create amazing art. And we've seen it many times. And a lot of this is all rooted in the blues, that whole theory of you're going through a difficult time, put it into the music.
Blues power.
Yeah, for sure.
Yes, absolutely. All Things Must Pass Away, Harrison Clapton and Other Assorted Love Songs will be out on the 20th of this month. It's available through Amazon. Any other sites you want to direct people to get a copy?
Well, Amazon is certainly the place to go. I know that independent bookstores out there would not like us saying that. And we get that. But it's certainly a place where you can count on the distributor to have copies. How about that?
Yep. Do you guys have social media pages you want to get out there? Any fans want to reach out to you?
I'm at PT Beatles on Twitter for the Producing the Beatles podcast that I do, which I highly encourage everyone to listen to, because
yes, I wanted to get that out there. Yeah. Talk about that.
Well, it's ostensibly from George Martin's point of view, but it's about production. It's about creativity. It's about how collaboration works. And, at its core, it's about how they created these songs step by step, what the process is. And you also learn about music, and we recreate some of the scores for some of the songs, Strawberry Fields and When I'm 64. And next season, I'll be working on more songs like that. And there'll be some more bonus episodes soon. I know a lot of people are emailing me, asking me when the next one's coming. So just hang in there. But Producing the Beatles. It's on iTunes and just about everywhere else you can get, even on Spotify.
All right, Producing the Beatles. Guys, thanks. It was great having you on.
Take
care.
Thanks to Kenneth Womack and Jason Kruppa for taking us through their book, All Things Must Pass Away, Harrison Clapton and Other Assorted Love Songs. And I didn't give Kenneth a chance to promote his website or social media pages. Make sure you check out his site. He's at kennethwomack.com. He's also on Twitter at Kenneth A. Womack. Be sure to subscribe to Booked on Rock at Spreaker or wherever you listen to your favorite podcast. You can find us online at bookedonrock.com. We're on Facebook at facebook.com/bookedonrockpodcast, on Twitter at bookedonrock. The email address, thebookedonrockpodcast@gmail.com. You can also contact me through the website. And if you're an author of a book on rock and you want to be on the podcast, just send me an email. I'm Eric Senich. Look forward to having you back again next time for another brand new episode of Booked on Rock.